My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. It's a pleasure to see you all. Some of you I may have seen yesterday as well. I will momentarily be having the pleasure of speaking to Yaakov Katz, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Previously served close to a decade as the Jerusalem Post military reporter and defense analyst, was lecturer at Harvard University, where he taught an advanced course in journalism, and was also Israel correspondent for Jane's Defense Weekly. Prior to taking up the role of editor-in-chief at the Jerusalem Post, Yaakov Katz served 2 years as a senior policy advisor to Israel's Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. He was also one of 12 international fellows, spending a year at the Nyman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. Originally from Chicago with a law degree from Maryland University, he's also the author of, amongst other things, Shadow Strike, Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power. It's a book that we're going to be discussing, and it follows on from the session that we had 2 sessions ago with Amos Yadlin talking about the Begin Doctrine. I'm also going to take this opportunity to remind people to switch off their phones or put them on silent. It was a nice reminder that not everyone does that. Eliakim Rubenstein's phone just went off. So I'm going to invite Yaakov Katz to the stage. Okay. So we heard a couple of hours ago Amos Yadlin talking about the Begin Doctrine, which he described very comprehensively, and I'll just say it in the shorter version, essentially that Israel will not allow those countries or regimes that have the intention to destroy Israel from attaining the means to do so. And of course the classic case, the case that led to the coining of the phrase was Begin's ordering of the strike on the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981. You wrote this fantastic book, and I commend it to everyone. It's a really amazing read. Reads like a thriller, essentially.
It's in Hebrew, too.
And it is out in Hebrew. Code Arizona. In Hebrew. September 2007, Israel sends its pilots to bomb a nuclear reactor in Syria. And in many ways, it can be seen as some sort of repeat of what happened in 81. There are many differences, which we'll discuss, but one difference which strikes me straight away is that Begin was on his way to a second election victory literally a few weeks after the strike on Osirak. Ehud Olmert in 2007 had fought an unpopular war, a war that went badly, according to popular opinion, a few months earlier, the summer before, the Second Lebanon War, and he was facing charges of corruption. This was a guy under a lot of pressure, a lot of political pressure. And I know that in writing the book, you had spent long hours talking to him, interviewing him. Can you set the scene for us, those sort of weeks and months leading up to Olmert's decision to attack the reactor, and especially in light of the sort of very tricky situation he was in politically?
Well, first of all, great to be here. Thank you, Paul. I think that one of the things, maybe I'll jump to the end and then go back to the beginning, but I think that one of the interesting parts of any story that you try to tell or retell is that there's only a certain amount of information that you can ever really get your hands on, no matter how many hours you spend with the stakeholders in these stories. And what led to their decision ultimately is something you'll never really know 100% in a scientific way, right? You'll talk to them, you'll talk to the people that they deliberated their decisions or their debates with, you'll talk to other people who were in the room, you'll try to get your hands on all of the different factors that were being taken into consideration, but at the end of the day, did they sleep good that night? Did they have a fight with someone in the morning? Did they have an upset stomach? I mean, there's a million different things that could impact the way these decisions are made. But I do think that there is a parallel, as you drew correctly, between Menachem Begin, who back in 81 was facing an election, and we know that the heads of the opposition very much suspected and accused him of electioneering with the decision to bomb the Iraq reactor. And Ehud Olmert, who in 2007 was in a position that he potentially saw the end of his political career, right? He was after a bad war in Lebanon. We all remember the 2006 war, 34 days, over 4,000 rockets, 122 soldiers killed, 2 of them still missing because they're being held by Hezbollah in Lebanon, to be returned only in 2008, over 60 Israeli civilians killed, the IDF shown to be delinquent in a number of areas on the ground in particular. Missile defense doesn't exist yet. We don't have Iron Dome at the time. And there's the Winograd Commission that's investigating and putting the blame on him already, right, in their interim report that had come out in March or April of 2007.
And if I recall, the defense minister and the chief of staff effectively resigned, but he kept his position.
So the defense minister is to resign in June of 2007. Dan Chalutz is also just about to resign he resigns in May or something like that. I'm sorry, February, and Gabi Ashkenazi takes over. And Amir Peretz leaves in June, and Ehud Barak switches him as the head of the Labor Party. But you also have the police investigations. Just to give you an example, Ehud Olmert, so Israel, if you're familiar with the story, Israel has some suspicion that something is happening in Syria. They can't really put their finger on what it is. And they decide, after Amos Yadlin, who was then the head of military intelligence at the time, has an argument with Meir Dagan, who was the head of the Mossad, and basically begs him to send a couple of Mossad agents to Europe, to the censor doesn't like that we say where, but it's been published, to Vienna, Austria. And they track this Syrian nuclear scientist whose name is Ibrahim Otman, who was the head of the Syrian Nuclear Atomic Energy Commission. And Ibrahim Otman made a tragic mistake from his perspective, as he left his laptop computer in his hotel room. And the Mossad agents go in and they attach a disk on key and they download the contents of the computer. And there's another little parentheses to that story, that when they bring the flash drive back to Israel, the Mossad agents give it to the military intelligence guys in Amman, Agaf HaModin, because they didn't want this operation to begin with. They kind of was doing Yadlin a favor. And then for 2 weeks it sits on a shelf somewhere. No one thinks to download and just de-encrypt. And then finally they do, and their jaw falls to the floor because they see photos of a nuclear reactor and they realize what's going on there. But fast forward to one day in March, Olmert, Dagan now sees these photos, calls Olmert, says, I got to come see you right away. And he comes at about 5 in the afternoon. Olmert had been touring the Gaza border that day, and he puts the photos on the table, and it's a game changer, right? This is a nuclear reactor being built in Syria, Israel's backyard, we're after a bad war, all that stuff. There's a knock on the door, right? So the whole world is now changing for Ehud Olmert, right? The whole world. And now he has to deliberate the possibility of attacking Syria. This is Syria pre-civil war, Syria with ballistic missiles, with more soldiers, more tanks, chemical weapons. And this is all going through his mind, his head, and there's a knock on the door, and he says, go away, but the knocking persists at the Prime Minister's office, and in walks his spokesperson at the time, Yanki Galanti, and he says, not now, and Yanki says, listen, on the 8 o'clock news, they're going to be breaking a story of another police investigation against you, and we need to come back with a response. So here's Olmert sitting in front of a table with photos that change potentially Israel forever, and he's got to deal with this at the same time. So that just kind of sets the scene. So again, to what you spoke about, did the elections play a role, or you hinted about Begin, did these investigations play a role in Olmert? Right now, Olmert will tell you, of course not, I did what's good for Israel. And I think he, to the greatest extent, he probably did. But I also think there's no doubt that in his mind, maybe this would boost his political career to an extent, right? These are politicians at the end of the day.
That's very true. And if I remember from the book, among the photos were also a picture of a ultimately quite well-known North Korean gentleman. Right. Is that right?
Well, that was photos of the core of the reactor, the building. It was being built like an ancient Ottoman period era kind of fortress that exists and are scattered throughout northern Syria. This is in the northeast, in a region called Deir ez-Zor. But so they kind of were concealing it in this inconspicuous-looking building, but inside was a nuclear reactor that was a replicate of the Yongbyon nuclear reactor in North Korea. And one of the photos showed Ibrahim Othman, this nuclear scientist, posing for a photo in front of the reactor, standing next to an Asian guy wearing one of these like blue Adidas tracksuits. And the Mossad guys look at this photo and they can't, they don't, they know Othman, they don't know every Asian person. So they run his photo through databases, and they come up and discover that this person's name is Chon Chi-bu. And Chon Chi-bu is the director of the Yongbyon nuclear complex, right? So beyond the fact that you had Bashar al-Assad building a nuclear reactor, you were also facing literally the greatest act of nuclear proliferation known to mankind, because we've seen stories of A.Q. Khan, the rogue Iranian nuclear scientist who sold centrifuge sketches and blueprints to different Pakistan and the Iranians, and you had other countries that were helping. But here was a rogue state, a bad actor already, North Korea, literally building for another rogue state bad actor a nuclear weapons program. There was no precedent to that in the world.
Right, and as we said before, and Amos Yadlin talked about it at length earlier, there was this precedent in Israel, which only Israel had, of this preemptive attack on nuclear facilities in order to prevent an enemy state getting this ultimate weapon. And we talk about the Begin Doctrine, of course, and although Begin himself did not coin that phrase, probably not least because he was too modest to do so, but it came to be known as the Begin Doctrine. So I wonder whether you assess that Olmert had Begin and 1981 in his mind when he was making these kinds of decisions, or do you think that was just not? He was just thinking more about the present and maybe his current situation.
So when working on the book, I did look back, because there was a very interesting distinction between the way Israel managed the media also and its messaging after the bombing of Osirak, and compared to the way it was done after the bombing of the Syrian reactor. So in 81, originally everyone was told not to talk, right? But then Menachem Begin himself goes on the radio and makes that announcement that it had been destroyed. And then he kind of draws a line in the sand. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing from him, but that everybody should now know that this is something we will never allow, right? And I think that set the tone. It was a message that he then articulated a number of times later in different words, but it was the same message. And that's what basically became known as the Begin Doctrine. Olmert, on the other hand, so Israel bombs the reactor, never speaks about it, never says a word. Years later, it took place in 2007. In 2018, only did the Israeli military censor allow for the first time for Israeli media, including myself at the Jerusalem Post and my book, to finally be able to start to tell the large parts of the story. Until then, we had to rely on foreign media reports. Because there was a fear that if we embarrass Bashar al-Assad, he'll then retaliate, right? That was the thinking at the time. So there was that distinction. But also, I think that Olmert, in his mind, it definitely, what Begin did, set the model for how things should happen. That yes, this is something that Israel can't live with. Had Begin not acted in 81, I'm not sure that Olmert would have had the immediate reaction that this reactor needs to be destroyed, right? To give you also an example, he studied the Begin model, right? He called David Ivry, who was the commander of the Air Force in the 1981 bombing. And they're very different strikes. The 81 bombing was really an operational feat, right? The fact that they were able to fly from Israel, was the Sinai, right, all the way to Iraq, bomb it, and come back. No one shot down, a complete success. There was no feeling that they thought they would lose a third or maybe even half of the pilots at the time. Here, it was a few hundred kilometers across the border. The military strike was not the big part of the story. It was still impressive, but Olmert met with Ivry because he wanted to understand what happened in those rooms. What was the decision making? What were the deliberations and the debates at the time? And there was no one better than him to be able to articulate that.
And another very interesting and important deliberation and debate was between Olmert and the White House, because one of the most fascinating and I think insightful aspects of your book is what it says about the U.S.-Israel relationship and the conversations that went on, the fascinating conversations that went on both between Olmert and Bush, and also between Bush and his inner circle, Vice President Dick Cheney and others. And because back in '81, it was kind of sprung on the Americans. This time around, where the Olmert government had a very good relationship, very close relationship, working relationship with the George W. Bush White House. And they wanted to, I think initially they actually wanted to know if America would be willing to do it, right? So can you play that out for us?
Well, one clear distinction and difference is that after the bombing of Osirak in '81, the then President Reagan allowed for an condemnation of Israel at the Security Council to pass through, did not veto it, and later suspended or froze the delivery of fighter jets to Israel. He then lifted it after a period of time. But there was real anger in Washington, and they were taken by surprise by what Menachem Begin decided to do. And there are stories of he calls the U.S. ambassador to the House and informs him, and they're very upset. Okay. Here it was completely different. And by the way, there were disagreements within the Israeli government of whether what Olmert did was the right thing or not. But Olmert, for a number of reasons, I would say two in particular, figured that the best move was to take this to the Americans. The first reason was he was genuinely concerned about the IDF preparedness. We saw what happened in the summer before during the Lebanon War. He was afraid that if Israel were to attack, that would lead to a war with Syria. If America were to attack, Syria might retaliate against Israel because we're just the closest and easiest target, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to an all-out conflict. The second reason was that his eyes were actually on Iran as well. Iran was still there and obviously pursuing their own nuclear capability. And it was obvious that if America attacks Syria, that sends a message to the Iranians as well. If Israel attacks Syria, well, we did it in Iraq, we did it now in Syria, we're the usual suspect. To create deterrence, it might create some, but not as much as if it was to be America. So for that reason, he went to Bush. People in the cabinet told him, you're making a mistake. You're endangering you're creating the possibility that it could leak out. And the whole Israel's advantage here was the element of surprise. Assad did not know that we knew he was building a nuclear reactor, right? The moment he knew, then if he were to discover that we knew, he could. They always spoke about this, probably just a metaphor, but he would bus kindergarten children to the reactor, and then Israel would never be able to attack it, right? So we needed to maintain the element of surprise, and sharing it with the Americans created a greater risk for it to leak out, number one. Number two is that the Americans could say no, and they could also say, you can't do it, and then what do you do, right? By not asking anything, you're not asking for a green light, you're not asking for a red light, no light, and then you can do whatever you want. And there were people who, I think even Ivry at the time, who was the Air Force commander in '81, consulted Olmert and advised Olmert and said, it might not be a good idea to go to the Americans because it could impair your operational freedom later on. But you are right, is that what people in the story do tend to forget is that Israel discovers it in March, sends Dagan and one of Olmert's people, Turbovich, to Washington. They present the intelligence to the Americans. And Bush only comes up with his decision in July. So there's about 3.5 months that Bush is deliberating himself what to do. And only in July 13th, he calls Olmert and says, I've decided not to attack. We're going to take it to the UN Security Council. I'll send Condoleezza Rice. She was then Secretary of State to Israel.
Maybe a legacy of Iraq. Maybe a legacy of
the understanding that speaking with all the people around him was that after the debacle in Iraq, the debacle in Afghanistan, he wasn't going to another military adventure against another Arab Muslim country. But what he did do is he said to his people after making that decision, and Olmert said to him on the phone, Mr. President, this is unacceptable. If you won't act, I will. He told his people, don't get in his way, let him do what he needs to get done. So it was a very different dynamic.
Right. That's fascinating. So let's talk a little about the present and obviously the Iranian situation, the Iranian threat. What do you make of the way that, I mean, it feels like we're in a situation right now where the current Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, came into office with the declared intention of adopting a very friendly posture towards the Americans and making sure that he didn't, for example, criticize them. He didn't go at the administration in the way that, say, Netanyahu did with the Obama administration. And people can have their own opinions of which was right, which was wrong. But it seems like we're in the same position in a way, either way. That there's this. That it looks like right now there's going to be an agreement, which, just like the last one, Israel will, to put it mildly, not be satisfied with. Is there something that Israel could have done differently, should do differently? Do you have some particular assessment of the relationship between the Bennett government and the Biden administration that sheds light on this?
We don't know so much of what,
right.
We don't know a lot of what's happening behind the scenes, but what we do know, and I was recently maybe a bit, I was critical of the Bennett government over this, is this is going to be a huge, colossal failure of theirs, right? A deal is going to be signed that is going to be a terrible deal, not just for Israel, but for the entire world, and it's happening on their watch. Now, they'll tell you is that we're getting along with the Americans, and Netanyahu soured that relationship, and by fighting with the Americans, that didn't get us any benefit, or we didn't get anything like that, and that might be true. But at the end of the day, and you know, you talk to Bennett and Lapid and any of these other people, and they'll tell you, no, it was Netanyahu Trump to pull out of the deal in 2018 and not having anything to fill that void, and that vacuum allowed the Iranians to run forward, and now this is what's happening. So it's his fault, no, but it's also your fault, right? And I think that Israelis need to wake up, right? It blows my mind how we are all walking as if we're in a trance. The Iranians, or in a daydreaming, the Iranians are about to get the best deal ever that will allow them to obtain a nuclear weapon when they want and how they want. It's going to happen. And no one in Israel talking about it. The government's not talking. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm an alarmist, but I don't know what, like you said, I don't know what Bennett could do right now. But he could be shouting from mountaintops, and would that make a difference? I'm not sure, right? I wouldn't recommend going to Congress, because I don't think that ultimately, when it was done by Netanyahu in 2015, it didn't work, and it undermined our bipartisan support in the United States, right? The flip side to that is that people will tell you in the Netanyahu circle that it did fast forward what led to the Abraham Accords, which might be true, I don't know, because they saw that the Israeli leader was fighting against Iran like no one else. But I don't think that's what's going to help, but we're kind of just sitting and not doing anything at the moment. And I'm not advocating military action. I don't think we're at that stage yet, right? But this is a bad deal that's about to happen. And here, there's almost apathy in Israel. And it blows my mind.
There's definitely some support for your there are some
I wish I had a better answer, though. I don't.
You have fellow alarmists in the audience, I think. If you are being alarmist, and I don't think you are. But.
I don't think I'm an. I think you look at what this deal is about to give them, right? A breakout that will take no time to obtain an SQ, a significant quantity of highly enriched uranium at a military grade levels. Now, by the way, once they have that, they don't have a nuclear weapon. That means they just have enough enriched material for one nuclear weapon. They then have to build a warhead. They have to build a nuclear weapon. They have to install it they have to build a warhead. They have to install it on a ballistic missile. There's a lot of stages that would take time. We've always said, talk about Amos Yadlin. I remember I was a reporter back when he was head of Amman, right, military intelligence. And every year they would, the Amman people and the Mossad people would always brief us, this is the year where they cross the point of no return. And then from 2005, it became 2006, and then 2007. Every year it got pushed off. And that had a lot to do with acts of sabotage that Israel was doing, and diplomacy and sanctions, and there was a lot that was going on. But at this point in time, they're there, right? They also have all the knowledge. The big difference, by the way, between Iran, Syria, and Iraq, which people also tend to forget. Syria was a nuclear reactor being built for Syria by North Korea. The Syrians didn't know how to build a nuclear weapons program. Iraq, it was the French who were building OCIRAC. Saddam and his scientists didn't know how to build a nuclear reactor. In Iran today, it's Iranian. It's not some foreigner. So even if we were to go in and destroy all their nuclear facilities, assuming we can, they just rebuild it. You can't delete the information and the knowledge they have in their heads. When you took out the nuclear reactor in Syria, they would need to call North Korea and get the North Koreans to come back again. When you did it in OCIRAC, they would need the French or someone else to come back again. In Iran, they don't need anyone. They have themselves. So therefore, it just puts a whole other question mark over the effectiveness even of a military strike one day.
Okay, well, if we didn't end on a cheery note, we can at least say I think that was a fascinating and enlightening conversation with Jakob Katz. Thank you so much
for
Paul. Joining us. Shadow Strike, Beirut, Code, Arizona. I recommend it heartily. And please remain in your seats for the next session. Thank you, everyone.